Were you successful with that form? Let's build it together. As in the template-driven assignment, I will do it right below the instructions here, and I will start by adding the form element here. And generally, I will start by creating it in my HTML code here, though that will not create the form for Angular, because we will later set it up in TypeScript and then connect it to our template code here. So as before, I'll add a form group div with a label for the name. So project name would be a fitting description. And I'll add an input. Type text sounds all right. ID name sounds all right. I'll split it up over multiple lines already since we're going to add some things, and add a class of form control. This is the first input. I'm going to duplicate this because now I want to add the email of the person who created this project, you could say. So let's simply set up the mail input here, make it of type email maybe. And I want to add that drop down. So let's add another form group. And in there, select drop down. We don't need the name actually. We need a label though, where we set the status. So project status would be a fitting description, I guess. Set the ID to status therefore. And in the select, we need our options. Now you could use an array to dynamically populate them or hard code them in there. I will go with the hard-coded approach here, though you will typically probably have the dynamic one. The first value would be, as you see up here, stable. So say stable here. And thereafter we also have critical with a display value of critical, and finished where we display finished. So this would be our dropdown. I also want to add the form control class to that and split it over multiple lines. Then I'll add the button at the end of the form with the classes button and button primary, make it of type submit, and simply say create project maybe to mix it up. So this is the general setup. ngserve is already running. Looks all right to me. Stable is selected by default because it's the first element we added here. Now let's create this form in TypeScript. So in my app component here, I'll name it project form and it will be of type form group. Make sure to import this from @AngularForms. What else did we learn? We need to unlock all the reactive form directives by going to app module, and we don't need forms module, we need reactive forms module. So make sure to import that from @AngularForms and add it to the imports array here. With that added, we will later be able to synchronize it. For now, let's create this form, and I'll again do this in ng-oninit. So I'll add the oninit lifecycle hook and import it from @AngularCore. ng-oninit gets added here. And then I will set my project form equal to a new form group, because again, the outer form is just a form group, where I will pass a JavaScript object to configure it. Now here I want to have, let's say, a project name control, so a new form control therefore, with a default value of null. I don't want to pre-populate it. And for now I will only add the validator, which requires it to be not empty. Make sure to import validators from @AngularForms, because that's the first requirement. It should not be empty. Now for mail, I'm going to duplicate this and set up my email control. It's also null, but it has more than one validator. It does have the required validator, but then it has the email validator. Again, don't execute these methods. You only want to pass the reference to the methods. Well, the final control is this drop down here with stable, critical, and finished. So I'll add yet another control. Now here I will name this project status. Form control here I will set a different default value. It would make sense to have stable as the default value, but that's selected automatically. I want to change this, so I will set it to critical. This is the value we need to assign with a lowercase c at the beginning, because that's the behind the scenes value HTML knows. So let's pass a string with critical here. And well, we don't need any validators because we can't unselect it anyways. This is our form. Of course, feel free to also nest this to add a form group if you want. This would be an extra challenge. Now, this is the basic setup where all is on the same level in this form. With this form created, we need to synchronize it with our HTML code. Again, just because it's important. For this, you will need Reactive Forms module. And then I can go to my form here and with property binding, bind form group to my project form, to this form we just created. Now let's also connect the inputs, like here, with form control name, of course, to tell Angular which name does our control have in a form, in our form. Here it's project name for this first input, so I'll pass this here. For the email, it will just be email. And for the dropdown, if we have a look at our TypeScript code, it was project status. So I will pass project status here. Now our form is connected. I will now also add ng-submit to submit it and call onSaveProject maybe, and create this method now in my TypeScript file here, in the app component TypeScript file. And here I simply want to log this project form value because I'm only interested in the value. So ng-serve is still running as mentioned before. It's recompiling. This looks good, no errors. Let's enter something here and let's hit create project. And we see the value looks good. Looks like we successfully connected it. Now if we have a look at our instructions here in the HTML code, we finished this part. We created the form, we added the controls, and we set up this basic validation. Now we are required to create our own validator, which doesn't allow test as a project name. Well, we saw how to do this, and we could do this here in the same file as we did before, but to mix it up and show you that you can also create your own validators bundle, kind of, I will create a new file here in my app folder, and I will name it custom validators.ts. And in there, I will export a class, which I'll name custom validators. Now, you probably don't have that solution, which is absolutely fine. It's just that I want to also show you an alternative. I want you to learn something when looking at my solution too, even if you did have a perfect solution before. So this is just an alternative, not strictly better, just an alternative. In my custom validators class here, I want to have a static function which I'll name invalidProjectName. Now, for such a specific validator, having a global bundle of validators might not make very much sense, but I guess you can imagine projects, apps, where you do have such a global repository of validators. In the end, we're using the built-in repository of validators here too. Now we're creating our own ones. So invalidProjectName will receive a form control here as input. Make sure to import it in this TypeScript file too, because we're using the type here, so we need to tell TypeScript where this is coming from. And we will return an object where we again have a key value pair, where we have a key which represents our error code, and then a boolean. And now I simply want to check if control value equals test. And if this is the case, I will return an object where I say invalid project name is true, like this. Otherwise, I will return null. So with this, I created my own static method. Static is important so that we can access it without having to instantiate our own class here. Now back in our app component, we can assign this by going to the project name, wrapping this required validator in an array because we're now going to add multiple validators. And in here, I now want to reference my custom validators class, which I therefore need to import at the top from /custom validators. And in there, the invalid project name function, which we don't execute as before. And as a side note, if you use this in there, make sure to bind it again, even if that were placed in the app component TypeScript file, because it will be executed by Angular at runtime, and then this will not refer to what it refers to during development, in this case here. So this allows me to save it. Let's now check the validity. If we inspect this input here, it's invalid because it's empty. If I enter something, it's valid. If I enter test, it becomes invalid again, so our own validator works. Again, it would have been perfectly fine if you would have added this to your app component. Let's now add an asynchronous validator. So here I will implement the same with async in front of it to make clear what the difference is. And I'll then also name it invalid project name. Of course, you could also create this in the app component file. We will receive the form control here, and we will return either a promise of type any or an observable of type any. An observable needs to be imported from rxjs/observable. With this in here, I again will create a promise I will return. So a new promise, which will receive a function as an argument to the constructor. This function will receive resolve and reject. And then I will execute a timeout in there. Let's say after 2 seconds, I want to execute this function here, this anonymous function, where I will again check if the control value equals test. So as in the synchronous validator, but now asynchronously. If this is the case, I will resolve this exact same error code here actually. So like this. Otherwise, I will resolve null. So we should resolve null if it is valid. Well, and then I can return the promise here. Now with that, we can attach this validator. So besides our custom invalid project name here, let's actually change this to test project so that we do have 2 different values to check for. So I can leave the old validator on there and attach my asynchronous validator as a third argument to form control. Here I will also reach out to my custom validators and then the async invalid project name. Again, don't execute it, only pass the reference. And I will simply split this over multiple lines to be in line with the requirements of TS-lint here. So, like that. So with that, we configured this form control, null default value, 2 validators, one of them our own validator, and the asynchronous validator checking for the test project name. With that, let's save this and therefore reload this project and now inspect our project name. It's invalid. If I enter test there, it's also invalid. If I enter test per, it's pending and valid. If I enter test project, it's pending and invalid. So our own asynchronous validator is working too. And with that, we practiced some of the things you learned in the last lectures of this course. Again, feel free to play around with that, build much more complex forms. And in the next course module, we're actually going to apply some of the knowledge you gained in our course project in the recipe book. See you there. Welcome back to our recipe book course app. We already added a lot of features to it. Now I want to add forms. We have 2 places where we need to add forms. When we create a new recipe or edit a recipe in the recipe edit component, and on the shopping list here. We already are able to add elements to the shopping list, but we can handle this in a better way through a form. And then I also want to make these other buttons here work. The form for the recipe. As soon as we can create new ones, I also want to make the delete button work. Let's start with the shopping list form in the next lectures. Here, I want to use the template-driven approach, and certainly feel free to go ahead and try implementing this on your own, but there are a couple of different approaches of implementing it, so probably we won't have the same solution. In the next lecture, we'll start together and I will show you my approach.